We're going to get started. Hello, APBP Minnesota. I want to start off by thanking our hosts tonight, Toole Design Group and the Minnesota Chapter of APBP. And now, to talk about protected bikeway design in North America, please welcome Jennifer Toole.
Greta, thank you so much for that nice introduction. And I am so honored to be here for your first event for APBP. It's so exciting. And I just want to also put in a plug for APBP. It's an organization with about 2,500 members nationwide. There's over 30 here in the Twin Cities. And it's the most affordable membership. You get a lot for your money. It's only about $100 a year, and you get so much for it. So I really encourage you to join. And I want to just recognize my staff. If you'll all raise your hands, I want to thank them for helping to organize this. And again, so honored to be here. And to talk about this topic today, you know, I think that this is a really interesting time in our profession. Things are changing a lot about how we think about bicycling, how we think about transportation in general. And just sort of to set the stage, I think that these are some statistics that most of us transportation geeks know. But travel is changing quite a bit in this country. In fact, vehicle miles traveled peaked in about 2005, 2006, and has been going down since then. And this is something that no one expected to happen. In fact, our traffic engineer, Hannah Pritchard, told me the other day that FHWA has actually, they have reduced their forecasted VMTs for the next, how many years?
So, for the last 30 years, FHWA has taken the total amount of vehicle miles traveled in the country and said, goes up about 2% per year. So with no other information, traffic engineers say, how about 2% per year? Nationally, VMT has leveled off from 2008. FHWA just came out and said, okay, how about 0.75% per year? Which is less than half. It's still, if you ask people, it's still not going up. But
right.
It's a significant change in the amount of future traffic that we try to plan.
Yeah, so it doesn't sound like a big change, but it is really sort of meteoric in transportation forecasting. We also know that part of this is fueled by the changing habits of this generation, the millennials. Frankly, they really don't want to drive cars to everywhere that they go, and so they bike a lot more than previous generations, certainly more than my generation did. They walk more, and they take a lot more trips on transit, which often involve a walking trip as well. So, this is a big change as well. But I think it's also important to recognize it's not just about that age group. Other age groups are biking more as well. In fact, if you look at the age group that has the highest amount of increase in bicycling, it's the... Yeah. So this is not just about accommodating young people. It's about all adults. And actually, the statistic up there that worries me the most is the 5 to 15-year-olds. They're biking a lot less. So that's a little worrisome. We have more data on bicyclists now than we have had in previous, in all the years before. We know that there is a very large group of folks that would like to bike. They're interested in it, but they're concerned about their safety. But they represent a sort of untapped potential when it comes to bicycling in this country. And then we also, our notions of what makes a good bicycle facility are also changing. And increasingly, we're looking to separate bikes from high speed, high volumes of traffic And this is a graph that the People for Bikes created. It sort of shows that trend in the development of protected bike lanes in this country. It's really skyrocketing. We see that here in the Twin Cities as well, with quite a few projects planned with separated bike lanes. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some observations that we have about separated bike lanes, and I'm going to talk about some experiences that the Netherlands has had. They are way out ahead of us in terms of accommodating bicyclists and building separated bike lanes. In fact, we did a study tour last May to the Netherlands, and that's actually me on that bike there. And no, I am not wearing a helmet. Nobody wears a helmet in the Netherlands because it's such a safe place to bike. But we went to take a look at how they handle separation in different situations. And in fact, we focused our time looking at suburban areas of the Netherlands to see how they handle bike facilities there. And so I'm going to talk about it. But I'm going to start first with sort of a brief history of bikeway design here in this country and sort of contrast that with the Netherlands. So after World War II, we built a lot of highways in this country. This was the wave of the future. We, in many cases, flattened cities in order to build these highways. In the Netherlands, they had their cities were flattened, unfortunately, too, during World War II. And this is Rotterdam that was hit particularly hard by the Germans in World War II. They looked to the United States and our sort of modern transportation concepts to rebuild Rotterdam. And this is just an example of one of the streets. You can see pretty wide street. There aren't any bike lanes, and you know, pretty much designed for motor vehicle travel. About that time in this country, we started getting interested in how do we accommodate bikes within this system. And California was one of the first states to come out with a bikeway planning and design guide. This is back in 1972. And the first version of that guide had separated bike lanes in it. It recommended separation at intersections and along streets. Then this guy came along. I don't know how many of you are familiar with John Forrester, but he had a tremendous impact on our notions of how to accommodate bikes in this country. And his theory was that bicyclists have the right to be out in traffic and to use the full width of the roadway. And then he, of course, wrote a book, and because it was the only book about bicycling for a very long time, that theory was adopted by a lot of advocates in our country and made statements like cyclists fare best when they act and are treated as drivers of vehicles. This is another statement that John Forrester made. I love it. Vehicular cycling is faster and more enjoyable so that the plain joy of cycling overrides the annoyance of even heavy traffic. Fortunately, most people began to see that this was didn't quite pass the smell test. This is not a fun place to bike. And even though you can tell that bicyclist is in the correct position on that street as a vehicular cyclist, it's certainly not a good place to bike. That viewpoint spawned a whole series of design treatments in this country, and the wide outside lane was one of those design treatments. So this is sort of the 70s concept of having a lane wide enough that a bicyclist and a motor vehicle could exist in the same space without the motorist having to move into another lane to get by. Unfortunately, cars tend to go faster. Drivers tend to go faster in wider lanes. So it had the impact of reducing comfort for bicyclists as well. And really, as we look at some of the new things that we use on streets, because we really came out of that sort of vehicular cycling viewpoint. Shared lane markings, the bikes may use full lane sign. I really can't underemphasize the impact that John Forrester had on our profession in terms of how we design streets. So we look at the share of workers commuting by bikes during those years, and really, we didn't have very much of an increase at all. We're still very, very low in terms of the number of people who commute by bicycles. All the way through the 1990s, still below 2%. So meanwhile in the Netherlands, they had built a lot of fat roads, sort of following the lead of the Americans, and they became dismayed at the amount of people who were getting hit and killed. And this Stop Kindermoord movement began. Stop Kindermoord means stop child murder, and it was all about their concerns about road fatalities. These are all fatalities, not just bike facilities. But with faster traffic came more pedestrian deaths, more children were dying in vehicles, and more kids on bikes were dying as well, both children and adults. So they began to change the way they designed their streets and provide more dedicated space for bicyclists and reintegrate them into their transportation system. I want you to pay attention to that house right there, that apartment building right there. So I'm going to take you down to street level and show you what this street looks like 20 years later, 1980. This was the beginning of their work to provide separated bike lanes in the Netherlands. They did this there are thousands and thousands of projects. Really, they did this to almost every street in their country. This is just another example of a project that we looked at where they had a bike lane in the street that added the cycle track or separated bike lanes adjacent to the waterfront. This had a dramatic impact on traffic fatalities in the Netherlands. Went down to almost negligible child deaths, and as a result, the Netherlands is a very safe place to travel nowadays. This is what it looks like now here in 2014 at ground level, and you can see what they have done is they've engineered good behavior, basically. They made it so that drivers don't feel comfortable going around corners really fast. They turn at slower speeds, and that gives them enough time to check to see. You can see that driver is looking over his shoulder to see what's coming. This is a yield condition. They use these markings quite a bit. We'll talk about that some more in a second. You can see that people feel extremely comfortable bicycling. No one's wearing a helmet in this picture, and I know a lot of folks here get very upset over seeing people without helmets on. But you know, the traffic fatalities don't lie. Bicycle fatalities and injuries are extremely low in the Netherlands, and that's why people feel comfortable not wearing a helmet. Frankly, you know, in this country, helmets aren't doing the job for us. We still have a much higher fatality and injury rate. So I sort of think of it this way. The Dutch are very comfortable on bikes. We have to put on costumes in order to ride and wear helmets, and it's all because our streets don't feel comfortable for most people riding bikes. So I thought it might be helpful just to sort of show you this system in action. I'm going to start this video. Maybe. There we go. Just to give you an idea of what it looks like, what a typical intersection looks like. This is a good one because it's a pretty big intersection. You can see it's got multiple lanes of traffic. And you can see that the light has now turned red for the drivers. Bicyclists are waiting until they get the green light, and they go. In general, what we observed is that people tend to follow the rules because the system's designed to work for them. So you don't have a lot of drivers cutting off cyclists because they're not given those cues to drive fast in the roadway environment. So I thought maybe it'd be good to talk about some of the myths that I've heard many times about the Dutch and why they bike so much. And people say, well, their culture is different and they ride bikes because they care more about the environment and health than we do as Americans. Well, that is absolutely not true. I can't tell you how many people I saw smoking while they were biking. And really, the reason they ride is because it's the most convenient mode of transportation for certain trips. Not all trips. They all have cars too, but for certain trips, they've made it easy enough to ride a bike that there's really just, it's just a natural thing to do. And I love this picture. It's like perfect 8 to 80 kind of example. It's a grandfather picking his son up from school. He's got his granddaughter actually on the back of the bike. And there's a lot of people who ride this way with one hand on a child as they're riding and sort of making sure, directing that kid to where they want them to go. Another myth is they don't have suburbs like ours. And that's not true either. This is suburban Netherlands. You can see there's a nice gas station here. It's very low density. They still design their streets with separated bike lanes even in these areas, and you see a lot of people biking. The trip distances are longer, of course. So there are more people who drive longer distances, but they do have suburbs. I've heard people say, well, their urban areas are totally different from ours. They don't have fat roads like we do. They have plenty of fat roads. We saw a lot of them. This is just one example of a pretty complicated intersection, but you can see they still manage to provide separated bike lanes through the intersection. In this case, they have a two-way bike lane. Here, this is connecting to a big bridge that takes you over the river. So, and the other thing I hear is, well, everybody follows the rules there, and our drivers aren't courteous, and our cyclists break the rules all the time. It just won't work here. The truth is people break the rules there too. This is actually a good example. This was one of the few bike lanes that we rode on while we were there, and it was an experiment. They were having trouble getting enough space for a separated bike lane because there were some environmental issues, really old growth trees. So we've tried this experiment here in this country too. They took the center line out of the street and they made it a yield street. And they were not happy with the results. And the next slide will sort of show you why. We were in a pretty big group. We must have had at least 10 people riding. And this is what happened when two cars were passing. They just kind of squeezed us out. So this is, it's not true that all their drivers are courteous. They're just like our drivers. They do things based on the design of the street. Okay, so something they're doing is working because we know that the Dutch bicycle mode share is pretty high, anywhere from 20 to 50% of all trips. And that's largely because they provide such a high quality environment. Okay, so back to the United States. Meanwhile, about the 1990s, the road diet takes off. And we start looking at our roads and thinking of ways that we can reallocate existing street space to provide for bike facilities. So this is a good example of one of those projects. We built a lot of bike lanes in this country in the 90s. We're still building lots of bike lanes here in the US. And also introduced some more innovative facilities. things like climbing lanes, where you have a bike lane in the uphill direction and a shared lane marking in the downhill direction in cases when you don't have enough space for 2 bike lanes. Also introduced green-colored bike lanes. We debated for a while what color it should be. We settled on green. And so that's another innovation that we came up with. And then we also started building protected bike lanes, and you can see that in most cities, it wasn't until we began building some of the more higher quality bikeways that we saw changes in the share of workers commuting by bicycles. Still very low compared to the numbers in the Netherlands, but clearly those higher quality facilities are having an impact on bicycle commuting. And so one of the things that I want to talk about is some of the limitations of bike lanes and the reasons why the Dutch have adopted separated bike lanes as a solution. And it's because bike lanes have some limitations. And this is a really good example. It's a bike lane in a urban area, high traffic volumes, and you can see the bicyclists here coming down. This is a very, very common thing to do in order to maintain capacity at the intersection so this guy can take a right, this guy can take a left. We drop the bike lane at the intersection. And so at the very location where most bicyclists are at risk, we have most crashes occur at intersections, we drop the thing that's protecting them. So very, very common in this country. In places where parking is at a premium, we have a lot of illegal parking in bike lanes. There's really nothing to prevent this. There's no physical barrier to keep people from parking in that space, and so it happens quite frequently. There's some uncertainty in bike lanes, right? We have high parking turnover. At any moment, somebody could swing a door out in front of you. And so you have that sort of uncertainty as you bike along a row of parked cars. A lot of discontinuity. This is, again, a location at an intersection where the bike lane was dropped. We put in a shared lane marking to make ourselves feel better about the fact that we took the bike lane away at the intersection. In this case, somebody's double parked, so this guy has to sort of weave his way through all this to get to the intersection. Not a very comfortable place for a bicyclist. And this is the same guy. He was next to a bus, and during the all red clearance phase, he decided to run the light because he needed to get out in front of that bus. He didn't want to take off and have to fight for space in the intersection in front of that bus. So the question is he a scofflaw, or was that a rational act, actually? He did what was safer for him. So I think what the point is that in many cases, we engineer bad behavior in this country rather than the good behavior that we see in drivers in the Netherlands. So who is our target user? I think it's time in this country to sort of say, all right, are we going to design for people who feel comfortable riding in traffic? Are we going to design for folks that don't feel that same comfort and need the protection along the street and at intersections? So let's talk about what makes for good design in this country, good separated bike lane design. A lot of the facilities that we have in the United States have been retrofitted onto the street that they're on. There's a great example right out here in front. There's the first sort of, I think of them as the 1.0 versions of separated bike lanes here in the United States. This is an example in Washington, D.C. It's a two-way cycle track or separated bike lane. And so let's talk a little bit about terminology, because you'll hear me sort of saying cycle track and separated bike lane. So People for Bikes did a survey a few years ago, and they asked regular people, not people in our industry, to tell them what this thing is. What are the words that you would use to describe this? And this is what they got back. So 30% said, oh, that's a bike path. But that's the name of a different facility. So they decided not to pick that. But about 42% liked either separated bike lanes or protected bike lanes. Cycle tracks, not so much. So the term cycle tracks is what we've been using quite a bit for these facilities, sort of on its way out in this country. And there's a little bit of a debate about whether to call them separated or protected. I've noticed that the bicycle advocates like protected bike lanes. Federal Highway Administration is coming out with a guide that will call them separated bike lanes. So I don't think it really matters. One or the other, pick one and just go with it. So I'm going to show you some images that come from a guide that we're doing right now for the Massachusetts Department of Transportation. MassDOT is funding a program to replace a lot of their bridges, and as a part of that, they're including separated bike lanes. And so they wanted to develop a design guide for how to do these facilities, because there's not a lot of good design guidance out there. And so this is one of the images from that guide. We came up with a terminology to describe different ways of different types of separated bike lanes. They can be at sidewalk level. They can be at an intermediate level between the sidewalk and the street. They can be at street level and curb separated, or street level and object separated. This is, most of the retrofit projects fall into this category. And in each case, they have a buffer between the sidewalk and the bike lane and a street buffer. The guide has a lot of different charts to define sort of minimum and desirable widths for those different zones. This is just one of the charts that shows street buffer widths with on-street parking and without on-street parking. Just to give you sort of a visual of different buffer types, particularly when you have higher speeds and higher volumes of traffic, having a wider buffer is good, and that's sort of the ideal environment. We don't have this much right-of-way on all of our streets, however, and so we end up with much narrower buffers. So this is an object separated by bike lane. This one's separated by a line of parked cars, just like the one we have out front. This one is not as good. This is a really constrained street in DC. I'm not sure it's really working so well, but it's a two-way separated bike lane on one side of the street. It's really not enough separation, I think, to feel safe. But sometimes you have to make compromises when you got limited right-of-way. Different types of sidewalk buffers. Ideally, there's some sort of vertical separation between the sidewalk and the bikeway. We notice that when that separation is there, that pedestrians tend to stay out of that space, out of the bike space more. This is an example from Cambridge, Massachusetts. There's really no vertical separation, but there's a visual separation by the use of materials. They actually have a lot of people who walk in that bike lane because of that, I think. These are just some basic information on one-way separated bike lane widths. You can see with 5 feet being the minimum width, it's not terribly comfortable for bikes to ride side by side. Bicyclists like to ride side by side. So ideally, especially when you have higher volumes of bicyclists, 6.5 feet as a minimum is a better width for bicyclists. Two-way bike lane widths, 8 feet can be okay for separated bike lanes that don't get a tremendous amount of traffic, but once they have more traffic, they need to be wider than 8 feet. And one thing I want to mention, that two-way bike separated bike lanes can be helpful in terms of, because they take up less space, and especially when you have constraints, that can be an important goal. And they also can expand access on one-way streets, but they create some unique issues, safety issues at intersections. You really have to design them carefully to make sure that bicyclists are safe. So let's talk a little bit more about intersection design. This is something the Dutch do really well. So almost all of the pictures in this part are going to be from the Netherlands. Let's talk about some of the things they do well. Again, even when they have really busy intersections, and maybe especially when they have busy intersections, they separate bikes from traffic throughout the intersection. They don't reintegrate them into traffic at intersections, and it works really well. It takes a lot of work with signals and pavement markings, but it works well. And really, the issue is that a standard bike lane has a really large conflict zone, if you think about it. When you're in a standard bike lane and you want to take a left, the location that you might make that merging movement could be anywhere in this zone. And so that conflict zone is a lot bigger. When you separate the bicyclists at the intersection, you really reduce that conflict down to one location. So, so it helps, once you've designed that location well so that drivers are yielding, you have made bicyclists a lot safer. Unfortunately, right now, the guidance that we have in this country recommends the opposite, and I think it really stems from the fact that we're trying to retrofit these facilities into existing environments. This is the NACTO Urban Bikeway Design Guide. It actually recommends removing the protected cycle track barrier or parking lane and shifting the bike lane to be closer to or shared with the adjacent motor vehicle lane, which again really doesn't make sense if you figure that most bicycle crashes happen at intersections. So we're reintroducing them into the traffic flow in the very location where they're the least safe. This is some examples of the recommended design of those areas. And I guess I would say it's not that we shouldn't ever do this. This is better than just dropping the bike lane and sort of throwing up your hands and saying, good luck. But it still does create a situation that you know, to maintain capacity, we still have a larger mixing zone than separating the bicyclists and confining that zone to one location. And we tried all kinds of tricks. This is actually a facility in DC. This is on a separated bike lane, and this is a place where they have a very narrow left turn lane, and they've created this sort of, okay, here's where the mixing happens. Not sure it's totally successful, and this is what it looks like at the intersection. I can tell you this street has a lot of traffic, and it does not feel comfortable at the intersection. So this sort of gives you a feel for how the Dutch do this. And one of the important things is controlling large volumes of conflicting turn movements and also maintaining visual continuity across the intersection. And one of the most important parts of their separated bike lanes at intersections is this corner deflecting island, and I'll show you some examples of why. Another very important thing is to separate the bike crossing movement from the pedestrian crossing movement at intersections, so that it's very clear where bikes are supposed to be and where pedestrians are supposed to be. And those crosswalks are marked, well marked, and the pedestrians know where their crossing is in that location. It's important to have signals that are accessible for all ages. This is a great example, and you can see that they offer several options. The signal will detect the presence of a bicyclist, but they also provide the push button for bicyclists. I mentioned that corner deflection island. That's very important for slowing turning speeds at intersections. It gives the driver a place to wait as they, especially when there's a permissive right turn, they're given that message that you need to wait here until the bicycle is clear. They're at a better angle to see approaching bicyclists. And because they're going slower, they're much more likely to yield to bicyclists. The other thing that it does for bicyclists is it creates a queuing space. So if you have higher volumes, there's enough space for them to wait outside of the path of other approaching bicyclists. And as I mentioned, another important part of this is just the visual continuity. They do it with the color red, which is not the color that we would use in this country. We'd use green. But they make sure that there's no confusion about where the bicyclist is supposed to cross the intersection. We have some good examples of separated bike lanes in this country, but I'll tell you, I think most of them don't get the intersections right. And I'm going to show you an example. This is from the Indianapolis Cultural Trail. Really nice facility. Good separation, very clear who's supposed to be where. But at the intersection, it starts to lose the legibility. This is a good example. You can see the separated bike lane ends, and they're sort of left to figure out where to go. It's further compounded by the fact that the pedestrian signals are over here. So the pedestrian gets sort of the message that they need to come over here to push the button, and maybe this is where they're going to cross. So, you know, the result is that a lot of pedestrians walk in the separated bike lane. And so, again, design invites good behavior. And, but this is a good example of where we're going with separated bike lane design in this country. I'm not going to talk a lot about signals except to say that there are a lot of things that we're going to have to learn when it comes to designing good signals that work for these facilities. The National Committee on Uniform Traffic Control Devices has approved the use of bicycle signals, and it will be in the next MUTCD, which is great because we really need them in order to make separated bike lanes at intersections work well. Street crossings in general, again, good design invites good behavior. In the Netherlands, they're always raised to the level of the separated bike lane so that drivers know to yield at that location. So just another example of how they reinforce good behavior. Transit stops present a particular sort of issue for separated bike lanes because you need a place for pedestrians to wait for the transit vehicle that's outside of that separated bike lane. So the best design routes bicyclists behind the transit stop and also clearly defines where pedestrians should cross that space so that they're not crossing all along this area. So that's what it looks like in practice. And then when you have a situation with a constrained transit stop where you don't have a lot of right-of-way, this is another less desirable but also acceptable way of doing it. You can see here that the pedestrians wait on this area. And here's an example in practice. This is in Toronto. It's an example of a bus stop. And there's a sign indicating to pedestrians to wait behind this tactile warning strip, and that's how they handle it. Separated bike lanes create all kinds of new issues when it comes to maintenance that we're going to have to deal with. So they have to be swept, they have to be plowed in the winter. And I think some of the interesting things that we've seen around the country are agencies, transportation agencies that are sharing equipment with parks agencies because they tend to have smaller plows. This is in Washington, D.C. They're plowing those lanes with smaller vehicles. So just to sort of wrap up, some concerns here in the U.S. with how we're designing these facilities. I think right now, because most of our facilities have been retrofit projects, quality design for separated bike lanes is really not well understood. We don't have a lot of good examples in this country to look at. One thing that worries us quite a bit is that we see that new development where they're reconstructing entire streets often misses the mark when it comes to providing for bicyclists. There's a big emphasis on, we'll just lower the speeds so low that bicyclists can share the street and we don't need to have a bike facility. And really, if there are high volumes of traffic, you still need a place for bikes to ride in order for it to feel comfortable. So oftentimes we find that bikes are an afterthought, and then we come back and have to retrofit those spaces later. This is just an example of a brand new development, 14-foot sidewalk, 10-foot wide sort of tree well space, 14-foot wide stormwater planter, doing some really interesting things with green street design in this one, and a 7-foot walkway. If you look out on the street at this location, that's what we provide for the bicyclists. So not a great facility. It gets parked in a lot. And so, like I said, in a lot of cases, we end up going back to these same places that are brand new and retrofitting them so that we have a better bike facility, when we really should have just built it right the first time. And this is, so reallocating some of this space. There's so much space in this location devoted to sidewalk and planter. We could take the 5 feet out of the street, give it to the bike, steal 2 feet from someplace else, and you've got a very good separated bike lane that's safer, it's more attractive, and really just a better use of money altogether. So quality separated bike lane design is what we're after. We have a lot of learning, I think, to do in building these facilities around the country. There's some cities that are doing some really interesting things. I talked about the MassDOT Guide to Separated Bike Lane Design. They're going to be building about 15 miles of separated bike lanes in 2015. A lot of street reconstructions with curb-protected bike lanes. And all of that is really because they have a very engaged, persistent, and informed local advocacy community. Seattle is doing a lot of the same things. They're adding, a very important step is to have separated bike lanes in your design guides so that you have permission to do them. They're implementing a 33-mile protected bike lane network over the next 5 years. Again, really informed advocacy community that watches those projects and makes sure that they're done right. And I think you all are also a city to watch, or cities to watch. You guys have plans to build a protected bikeway network in Minneapolis. I think what's significant is also that you all are funding these plans. A lot of cities, they're on paper. Allocated a lot of money. St. Paul's Bicycle Master Plan has separated bike lanes identified as well, and a lot of money to build that network. Hennepin County's also identified in their Bike Master Plan an enhanced network. So leading the way in terms of county governments. And then MnDOT's developing a new bikeway design guide as well. So you'll be investing a lot of money here in the next decade on these types of facilities. You'll want to make sure that it's invested well and that bicyclists feel comfortable in those facilities so they use them. So people say, oh yeah, that was a good investment. We got lots of people out using them. Okay. So that's what I have for separated bike lane design. Any questions? Yes, Kelly.
So one of the things I think, especially in suburban communities, that we run into a lot is we talk about cycle paths or protected bikeways in a few areas, but then the community comes back and they really want a multi-use trail because they feel it's more family friendly. But then that, with any kind of actual cycling increase, would create a lot of conflict. And I guess how they dealt with, or how other communities dealt with separating. Getting suburban communities on board that cycle paths are family friendly and aren't
Right, I think that's a great question because that's something that we have been talking about a lot in Maryland, actually. We don't have the volumes necessarily to devote complete separation between bikes and pedestrians. And so one of the things we've been experimenting with is building that multi-use path, which is really a two-way. You can think of it as a two-way separated bike lane that allows pedestrians. But building it according to the good design principles that you see in the Netherlands, making sure that there's visual continuity. And yeah, maybe for the first decade that it's in place, it's shared with pedestrians. I think that that's okay. And especially in places where you have lower volumes of bicycle traffic. And as you can see, the Netherlands, their system evolved over time. So I think we should be willing to do that here in this country as well. Yes?
Just one thing that you said there, and this is one thing that I find difficult to reconcile here in the US. You mentioned that it's a two-way cycle path that allows pedestrians instead of a two-way pedestrian path that allows bicyclists. Can you talk more about how they manage to address that hierarchy in Europe and where are we failing in that regard?
Mm-hmm. Most of the time, they don't allow bikes to, at least in the Netherlands, to mix on the same facility. There's very few examples of that. I think it hinges on making sure that bicyclists know that they should yield to the slower user, and the path has to be wide enough. I think that's the other thing that often we compromise and we say, all right, well, we just don't have enough space, so it's going to be 8 feet wide, and that's not wide enough for two bicyclists to pass each other while a pedestrian is walking. You really need about 11 feet for that three-person passing movement to happen. And so I think, we have to send the right messages to bicyclists about yielding, and we need to make sure those facilities are wide enough. Other questions? Yes? Oh, yeah, her right there.
When it comes to talking with elected officials and people who actually make decisions about these things, are there particularly effective talking points that you like to refer to that can help convince them?
Well, I think a picture speaks 1,000 words. So having some good images, and this presentation will be available on the APBP website, I believe. That helps. I think most elected officials get that people want to feel safe and that they're probably not going to ride if they don't feel safe. And so appealing to that sort of, we need folks to be safe. Intersections are where most crashes occur, so we need some separation from traffic. Then the data is pretty clear. People, especially the interested but concerned category, want separation and really require it in order to make the choice to ride a bike. So citing that data is good as well. Okay. Any other questions or comments? Yes.
Whenever we see presentations like this, or whenever we have discussions about bicycling as transportation, there's always a lot of Euro envy in the room.
Yes.
I guess I believe that, that it isn't a question of who does a better job so much as from my point of view, they had a 40-year head start.
Yeah.
And since you're working in the trenches, I'm curious to know if you think that in 40 years, we will be beyond where they are.
Wow. I think it might take more than 40 years. You know, our country is a lot bigger than, the Netherlands is about the size of Maryland. You know, so we have a lot more to fix than I think than they did. But I can tell you that they you know, they've been very deliberate about going street by street. They don't have bike network plans where they identify, okay, this street will be bikeable, and this street will be bikeable, and this street will be bikeable, and the rest, well, we can't focus on those right now. Their philosophy is very much an egalitarian approach to transportation. They want to make sure, as the way it was described to me by multiple city officials in different cities in the Netherlands, they want to make it just as easy to walk, bike, get on a bus, or drive. And they accommodate drivers really well. They have an excellent system of highways and arterial roads. And so, but they want to make sure that those options exist. And I think right now we have a ways to go in reaching that point where we take that sort of egalitarian approach. So I don't know, maybe in 40 years, I hope. Me too.
I'll be dead.
I will be too. Okay, any other questions or comments? I'll let you guys get back to your beer. I think this is such a great venue. I think this is the best AV setup I've had. I should do all my presentations in bars. Yeah, over there?
This might be a little weird. I was wondering if there's a downside to too much separation. So if you've been biking in Minneapolis for 10 or 20 years, you're probably very comfortable just getting out on the road and biking.
Right.
But if you grow up in an area where it's separated, what happens when you don't have a dedicated facility?
Well, you know, so I should have showed some pictures of this, but not everything in the Netherlands is separated. In fact, they have streets they have a sign on the beginning of the street that says auto te gast, which means the auto is a guest. And those streets are extremely low-speed streets that have lower volumes of traffic. And bicyclists have the priority. They're bicycle priority streets. And I mean, but the key characteristics are low speeds and low volumes. They work great. So separation isn't required everywhere. But you know, so I think it's just when you have those higher speeds and higher volumes, which really is most of our streets outside of residential areas, unfortunately. 4,000 cars a day is sort of a good, 25 miles an hour is sort of a good cutoff, frankly. So, okay. Any other questions? Okay. Well, I just want to thank everybody for coming out. And again, I'm so honored to be invited to your inaugural APBP reception. And I'm sure you guys are going to do great things with this chapter. And look forward to seeing what you do. So, okay, back to your beer.